mean, the big question is why energy infrastructure in Iran isn't being hit.
And your answer to that is they want to use it.
Yes, I think that this is the end game.
My sense is that we're going to see more escalation from the Iranians. I mean, the regime is hardened, it's united. The thing that worries me most is if they go for what I would call the nuclear option, which is not a nuclear bomb, but rather they try to attack the desalination plants. If we start seeing desalination plants being attacked, then really all bets are off, and it's an all-out war.
Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. I'm Krishnan, Guru-Murthy in Jerusalem. Oil prices are spiking, well over $100 a barrel. And as this war goes on, the markets are clearly taking some fright at what this might mean for world economies. We've been seeing a series of statements from the Gulf states expressing their increasing fury at the way they've been drawn in to this war, notably from Saudi Arabia, who have reiterated their right to take any action to defend themselves that they feel is right. But there are also some theories now circulating about to what extent oil is part of this war and one of the motivations. To explore all of this, I'm joined by Guy Laron from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and author of Oil Wars, The Struggle for Control That Has Shaped the Modern World, and Bernard Haykel, Professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton, and a man who speaks regularly with the ruler of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, better known as MBS. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. Bernard, I mean, could you read into what the Saudis are saying publicly for us now and kind of explain, what do you think it means in terms of their calculation? Do you think they're thinking of joining the war?
The Saudis have been very clear for quite some time now, meaning at least a couple of years, that they are neutral. They don't want to be involved in this war. They saw that Israel was intent on attacking Iran, and they expected another attack after last year's 12-day war. And they've signaled to the Iranians that they will not allow their space, whether it's, their territory or their land or, the sea or the air, to be used against Iran. And they were very worried about the Iranian threat to them, that if the regime is existentially threatened, that the Iranians would launch an all-out attack on not just American bases in the region, in the Gulf region, but also on oil installations and other vital installations and infrastructure like desalination and so on. And the Saudis have made it very clear to the Iranians that if they pursue this, if they attack Saudi Arabia's vital infrastructure, that they would retaliate and respond to defend themselves. And they're now in a situation where that's increasingly happening. The Iranians have decided to expand the war, to make America and Israel and the world pay a price in terms of an economic downturn, higher oil prices, creating a crisis to draw in more countries to stop this war. And the Saudis basically are dreading that getting involved. They don't want to get involved. They're also dreading actually the downfall of an Iranian regime, because if a civil war takes place in Iran, you would have serious instability with a failed state next door. So they're really in a very, very difficult spot right now.
So they have a very different desired outcome from this war to both the United States and Israel, who each have slightly different desired outcomes as well. And yet they could all end up fighting on the same side.
Yeah, they could end up fighting on the same side. Although, again, I would add one more thing, which is that I'm not sure what the Saudis can do to add value by entering this war. They could, for instance, allow the Americans to use their bases to launch attacks. And, they have a base in Laron, which is just a few minutes away from Iran by fighter jet or missile. But as Saudi Air Force getting involved would mean that the Americans would have to get them into the scenario of the war with deconfliction and coordinating with the Israelis and the Americans, and that's very, very complicated.
And how do you think the Saudis differ from the rest of the Gulf states, particularly the UAE, in emphasis and what they want out of this?
I think actually the attitudes are very, very similar. They see Iran as an arsonist, as a very unstable regime that wants to create instability, and it's a revisionist regime that wants to see America expelled from the region. That's not something they want. They want stability. They want, an economically integrated region. So when it comes to Iran, I think all Gulf countries, the countries of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation countries, are all council countries, are all basically on the same side.
Guy, how are you reading this?
Well, it was interesting to listen to Professor Haykel, and I was thinking that unlike Israel, that wants to see this regime destroyed, the Gulf countries seem to want this regime to be contained. So that's a very different outcome that these players have in mind. But also, I think that we need to infer intentions from actions rather than official rhetoric from the Trump administration, because what we see is Israel pummeling military infrastructure. The U.S. is doing that as well, but neither the U.S. and until recently neither Israel didn't hit oil infrastructure, and Israel did that yesterday, and the U.S. kind of leaked to the press that went out of line. So the big question is why energy infrastructure in Iran isn't being hit, although this is definitely a point of vulnerability for Iran.
And your answer to that is they want to use it?
Yes, I think that this is the end game. This is where I think Israel and the U.S. diverge in their aims. While Israel do want to see this regime destroyed, they have no problem with Iran disintegrating or sinking into civil war. I think the best outcome for Trump is kind of Venezuela version of Iran, or Venezuelazing Iran, in the sense that he would use his navy and the American military presence in the Gulf to get into some kind of an arrangement on the oil. And that would mean that the US would control it in the same way it controls Venezuela's oil. And the US can achieve it either by taking control of the island of Har in the northern Persian Gulf, laying a siege on it, and, if worse comes to worse, destroying it. This is the point from which 90% of Iran's oil are being exported. So this is the point, again, where I infer intentions from actions rather than what Trump is saying. And we know, by the way, that it has been leaked that people in the Trump administration are thinking about the oil, about taking the island of Har, and that Trump himself talked about it with his advisors.
Isn't it sort of so far in the realms of fantasy that could be achievable? That first of all, the Iranian regime wouldn't destroy it, or would be so degraded that it couldn't attack, that it couldn't make that impossible, or secondly, that they would be so defeated and surrender that they would cooperate. The Venezuelan scenario seems, kind of absurd, doesn't it?
Well, you did hear Trump himself saying that there were a few leaders he thought about working with, but they were killed in the initial strike by Israel. So that means that this scenario was there from the start. And now he might be thinking about how to make it work. The idea is not to take over Iran's entire oil and gas infrastructure. The idea is to find people in the Iranian government that would be willing to make compromise. And in close conversations, that's what I read in the American media, Trump described how this agreement would look like. The uranium would stay there, but in a secure place where the US would know what goes on with the enriched uranium. And second, the US and Iran would work together on the oil. Now, this is not just about, capturing oil in abstract. I think this is part of the bigger strategic chessmate between President Trump and the ruler of China, President Xi. They're meeting at the end of this month. They have a summit planned. And last time, she made Trump back off by weaponizing rare earth supply, right? So if you want gallium or scandium and whatever rare earth that the American has to put in their high-tech military technology, then they have to deal with China and back off from the threat of heightened tariffs on Chinese finished goods. Well, Trump may appear in this summit and say, well, you might control the raw materials of the technology of the future, but I am now controlling the raw materials of the old economy, the energy economy. And China imports half of its oil and a third of its liquefied natural gas from the Gulf. And that's where the American Navy is right now. And that's a strategic surprise for China because it always thought that if US would do something like that, it would try to block the Straits of Malacca. So they built a navy to deal with that. But they haven't thought about the idea that the US would actually get into the Persian Gulf and try to control the Straits of Hormuz.
Professor Haykel, what do you make of this idea of this being a very complex chess game?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure President Trump is that strategic a thinker. I mean, I think that he did come to political awareness and consciousness in the 1970s when you had two oil crises in 73 and 79, and that he thinks that oil is really a very important strategic asset, and that the richest people on the planet are the oil sheikhs, which is why he gives so much deference and respect to countries like Abu Dhabi and the UAE and Qatar, and to some extent Saudi Arabia, of course. He sees, I think, that in this axis of resistance to America, with Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela, that the lowest hanging fruit, the weakest links are Venezuela and Iran in his thinking, and that they're very oil rich. So if he can somehow control their oil, change the regimes, that he's in a better position. He did this with Venezuela very successfully, and then made the analogy that the Iranian regime can't be too different. Everyone wants a deal, etc. in his thinking. And what he doesn't realize is that the Iranian regime is very different from the Venezuelan regime. It's an ideological regime, and they'd rather die, than give up on their ideology, as we saw with the killing of the supreme leader and many others there. So, he's dealing with a regime that will not capitulate. And is fighting an existential war right now, which is why they've expanded their reach and trying to create sow havoc all over the region. So I think Trump is really in many ways out of his depth here. He thought this would be a 4 or 5 week long war. It's going to last much longer. We see the price of oil today, I think, hit 120 at some point. That's a low price, by the way. If Hormuz stays closed for many more weeks, you're going to see a much higher price because something like almost 20% of the world's oil transits through there. And effectively today, Kuwait is not exporting, Iraq is not exporting from the south. Saudi Arabia can still export because it has an east-west pipeline, and the UAE. So, but we're seeing a major disruption in the flow of oil, and the last point I would say is that, oil is a global and fungible commodity. So if the Americans, it's not something you can kind of control, unless you balkanize or you fragment the market and you say, Kuwait, you can't sell oil to the Chinese. That's never going to happen, I don't think, no matter what President Trump wants. So that those are my quick reflections on some of these points, and I think that again, I think Trump hasn't thought about the day after, and the day after in Iran, even if this regime capitulates, could be a civil war, which would be very, very chaotic and spread a lot of instability in the Gulf. So we're far from out of the woods here, because whether the regime survives or doesn't, we're in a very tense and period of instability.
And where does this next period leave Saudi Arabia particularly? I mean, it's tempting to think, well, they'll be pleased because the oil price has gone up and they can still get their oil out and they can sell their oil to China as well, because they now have that ability, and that, to an extent, there's a win there as well.
Yeah, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. You see, if you're Saudi Arabia, and you want to build all these projects that they're building with the Vision 2030, which is a economic diversification plan to move away from dependence on oil, you certainly want oil to be, closer to $90 a barrel than at $60 a barrel or $50 a barrel. But you also don't want it to be so high that it creates what is called demand destruction. So permanent sort of destruction in demand, and people, moving towards EVs and other forms of energy very quickly, which means you'll lose customers in the long term. So they don't want a very high price for a very long period of time. They want a price that's in a, $90 to $100 band, for a sustained period. That would be good for them. But too high or too low is not good for them.
And while the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, how will they get their oil out? I mean, and how vulnerable is the Red Sea to the Houthis or whoever else?
Well, so the Saudis have this thing called the East-West pipeline, which can transport quite a significant amount of their production from where the oil is in the east to terminals in the west, and the terminals are far north of the Houthi area. So it's not likely that their oil is going to be blocked, despite Hormuz. Some of it will be. Also, I would say that the Saudis, were thinking about this and knew this was going to happen. So they have storage all over the world, like the Kuwaitis and others. So, for a while, for a few months, they can draw on their storage and keep their clients happy. But, again, if it goes beyond a couple of months, we're in uncharted waters. And in particular, because President Trump so far has said that he will not use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which is the reserve that's in the United States. And it's specifically there for moments like these.
I mean, when we've seen them together, it looks like the relationship between MBS and Trump is very good. How much do you think he can influence what Trump is doing?
Well, despite the reporting that he was for this war, in fact, MBS was against this war, and clearly made that known to President Trump. And still, President Trump, joined the war and was much more influenced by the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. And I suspect that Prime Minister Netanyahu told Trump something like, we have this regime completely, in check. We understand every aspect of it, and this will be a very short war. And I suspect that President Trump believed that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken such a big risk. This is the riskiest thing he's ever done. And if it doesn't go well, he will be forever tarnished with this disaster.
Guy, does that sound about right to you in terms of what Netanyahu would have said?
Yes, of course. But, whenever Trump decided that something that Netanyahu wanted to do was a red line for him, he was able to impose his will. When Trump wanted Netanyahu to end the war with Iran in June, he was absolutely explicit about it, yelling on the phone and yelling through his social truth account. The same thing happened in Gaza when Trump decided to impose a political solution on that conflict. He was able to do so. So what Netanyahu wanted to do, and definitely the intelligence, the depth of penetration that Israeli intelligence has in Iran, that might have been a factor. But I assume that it was Trump's own decision. I mean, it's frightening to think that the president of the United States is out of his depth and was led by, another foreign leader like the prime minister of Israel to this decision. But I think it's even more terrifying to think that he's a reckless geopolitical gambler. And once you zoom out from this current horrific war and you look at Panama and Venezuela and Greenland and now the Straits of Hormuz, you see a picture of someone who thinks that he doesn't need to lead the world through alliances and institutions like the US did before he came to power, but rather control the world through controlling various choke points and crucial resources.
What do you think that means for how the Americans and Israelis will see wanting to end this now? You know, it's tempting to sort of go, well, you know, we've seen how Trump responds to markets before. He's going to take fright soon. He's going to be under domestic pressure, and that's the point at which he'll want to stop, which obviously runs counter to your theory of him wanting to take control of oil facilities.
That I am absolutely willing to agree with, that he would want to cut his losses sooner than Israel, that Israel wants this war to go longer. That's good for Netanyahu, you know, his big strategy in the Middle East, but also domestically, it works in various ways for him. I can, you know, just as a short note, say that he had troubles passing the budget for 2026, and now it looks like it will go smoothly. And also, he seems to be thinking about snap elections after this war. You know, he would go to the ballot box as an imperator mundi that moved this successful operation against Iran. But the US, I think, would have a more pragmatic approach. And if Trump would think that he's not about to, you know, return his gamble, and every day that goes on from him, from this point onwards, he's losing. Yes, I can see Trump deciding to end the war sooner rather than later. I mean, we don't know what he knows and how he considered this. So far, he's making noises as if he's not going to back off, but Trump is mercurial. You know, we can't expect his how he would respond. But again, I would expect him to, you know, end the war sooner than Netanyahu wants.
Bernard, if Israel doesn't get total destruction and Trump doesn't get surrender, where does this leave the Gulf countries? You know, with the likelihood that this will be repeated in the future.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the Gulf countries were hoping that Ayatollah Khamenei, who was, I think, 86 or 87 when he was killed, you know, was the last of the hardliners, and that the next supreme leader of Iran would be a more moderate figure with whom they could do business. So they were banking on the moderation of the regime and therefore re-established diplomatic ties between Saudi and the UAE in 2023. They were also hoping that the Chinese would have a role in moderating the Iranian regime over time. And that's clearly not happened. You know, right now the Iranians have appointed an even more ideological person in the form of Mujtaba Khamenei, who's the son of the last supreme leader, as the new supreme leader. And so the Gulf countries are stuck with an arsonist next door in the form of Iran. They're hoping that, you know, at the moment, I imagine they're hoping that, you know, the regime survives but is greatly weakened, and it will take the regime 10, 20 years to rebuild its capacities. In the meantime, you know, things change over time. But they're not happy, you know, with any of the possible, you know, a regime downfall is not necessarily good because of the chaos that might ensue. A hardened regime is not good. What they want is a kind of more tamed, a more kind of less aggressive, less forward-leaning regime. I'm not sure that's what they're going to get. I mean, certainly Iran will be very weakened. But this regime, I suspect, is likely to survive because the opposition is very divided. There is no leader of the opposition in Iran. And the regime has all the guns and has shown that it's willing to kill tens of thousands of its own citizens to stay in power, which is what happened in January. And has no problem with, you know, burning the entire region if to survive. So you're stuck with, you know, a really bad neighbor.
And how do you think this changes the calculation on the Abraham Accords? You know, there's this sort of idea that Saudi Arabia will join and there'll be a great deal with Israel at the end, which the Saudis, you know, to date have, have said is impossible given the situation in Gaza and the lack of a Palestinian state. Does the Iran war change the calculation on whether or not Saudi will join the Abraham Accords and become friends with Israel?
I don't think so, because I think that the Saudi position is not just that Israel has to provide some sort of pathway to a Palestinian state, and begin negotiations with the Palestinians for that. Now they don't decide or impose what that Palestinian state would look like. That's for the negotiators to decide, and Israel effectively has veto power over what the outcome of these negotiations are likely to be. But the normalization with Israel was also tied with extracting concessions from the United States. The Saudis wanted a mutual defense agreement with NATO-like Article 5 type guarantees of security. They wanted a nuclear agreement. They wanted a number of other agreements. And, some of these agreements or concessions, they're unlikely to get from the Americans under President Trump, because the votes are not there in the Senate for that. So I think that normalization is something that they're going to indefinitely put off into the future and use it as sort of bait to try to extract as many concessions for themselves without ever actually signing on the dotted line.
Guy?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if this crisis would end with international pressure on Israel to move forward in the peace process. This is exactly what happened after the big energy crisis of the 1970s, and specifically after the Yom Kippur War, which was the reason for the first major oil crisis of the post-World War II era, the Arab boycott of 1973. So after that, the U.S. pushed Israel to relinquish step-by-step control over the Sinai Peninsula. And this is how we got the 1979 Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. So I would assume that, countries in the region, like the Gulf states, but also Europe and in the US, people would say, the real source of instability was actually Israel. This is how it all started. And the way to restore stability to the region is solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is how things started on the 7th of October. 2023. So this might be a bigger deal than just the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. That would create real pressure on Israel to solve its own problems.
But do you think the politics of Israel could get anywhere on that? I mean, everyone seems so united.
Well, that would be the big obstacle, because in the 1970s, Israel had a relatively pragmatic leadership and very dependent on the U.S., not just in general, specifically economically. After the Yom Kippur War, Israel was very dependent on aid from the U.S. It is less so now. And the leadership currently is far less pragmatic. And the coalition around Netanyahu sees, control of the West Bank like, I don't know, the Serbs saw Kosovo. So it's hard to, if they remain in power after the upcoming election cycle, it's hard to see Israel doing compromises. It is easy to see Israel more and more under, international pressure.
And let me just tell you, actually, while we've been talking, I've been sent a statement from the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman warning against any attempt to attack Karg Island, saying that Iran has been a graveyard for foreigners, when he was asked to respond to reports that the US could target the island. So, there's something of a warning. Don't try it.
Yeah, it's an issue. American drones were spotted next to the island. So it's clear that the Iranians would talk about it.
Let me just end with you both. Just given where we are, how you see things unfolding in the short to medium term. Bernard, what should we expect?
My sense is that we're going to see more escalation from the Iranians. I mean, the regime is hardened, it's united, the security services are united, the Revolutionary Guard Corps is definitely in charge. They have a very aggressive and forward-leaning leader now in Mujtaba Khamenei. I think that the thing that worries me most is if they go for what I would call the nuclear option, which is not a nuclear bomb, but rather they try to attack the desalination plants in the Persian Gulf and on the Red Sea. If they knock out the water desalination plants, it would mean that, large cities with 7-8 million people like Riyadh, we're already seeing this problem in Bahrain, by the way, because the desal plant there was attacked. Large cities don't have enough water from the aquifers to sustain themselves. And you would have a real kind of crisis in the kingdom, in the UAE. Dubai wouldn't survive without desalination. And you would have a major problem for these countries. So if we start seeing desalination plants being attacked, then really all bets are off. And it's an all-out war. And I suspect that it would require ground troops to bring down the regime in Iran.
And if you were whispering in Trump's ear and he was listening, what would you say?
I would probably say, that unless you're willing to go long and sustain, $10, $15 a gallon gasoline prices in America, and of course lose the November elections, then you should call it a win and try to find a way to kind of to de-escalate and take and just try to an off ramp, as it were, from this war.
Guy?
I largely accept this assessment about the U.S. Unable to sustain this conflict much longer. So I would expect that within the next week, 2-3 weeks, there'll be some sort of ceasefire, because the U.S. doesn't have the mechanism. It cannot ensure convoys going out of the Straits of Hormuz. It cannot supply insurance to tankers coming in and out. And it doesn't have enough of its own strategic petroleum reserve to sustain this conflict. And obviously, Trump is troubled by the rising price of oil and gas. So I would expect some kind of a ceasefire. Trump would say he won. The Israelis would say we won, and we're preparing for the next round. And the U.S. Saying to the Iranians, okay, we gave you a bloody nose. Now let's talk again and see if you're willing to offer us something better so you won't be bombed again.
Thank you both very much indeed for your time. That's the forecast for today. Bye-bye.